7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. There, in its 217-word entirety, is the most famous speech in American history, given at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, exactly 82 years ago today. Why was it so short? What did it seek to achieve? What were its inspirations? How did people react to it? Why did it become so legendary? Stay tuned. It's Wednesday, the 19th of November. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we are still currently doing our best to row our little boat through something called an atmospheric river. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about smallpox. Why are we talking about smallpox? Because President Abraham Lincoln had a mild case of it on the day that he delivered the Gettysburg Address. As he's riding on the train from Washington to Gettysburg on Wednesday, the 18th of November, 1863, the day before the speech, he doesn't know he's got smallpox. The official diagnosis doesn't come until the next evening when he is on the train back to Washington. He just knows he really feels like shit. He's clearly coming down with some sort of malady, and it is vanishingly unlikely that he's going to be able to give the hour-long speech that people are expecting him to give tomorrow at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. There are 5 men in Lincoln's traveling party. He's brought along 3 members of his cabinet: Secretary of State William Seward, Interior Secretary John Usher, Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, and his 2 secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay. He remarked to Mr. Hay during the outbound train trip that he felt quite unwell and quite weak. On the morning of the event, he mentioned to Mr. Nicolay that he not just felt weak now, but also quite dizzy. Mr. Hay relates that during the speech itself, President Lincoln's face had what he described as a ghastly color, and that his general comportment was sad, mournful, almost haggard. Which is to say, the brevity of the Gettysburg Address wasn't a deliberate and intentional departure from the rhetorical conventions of the day. Rather, it was a function of the fact that Lincoln was a very sick man, and he didn't have more than a couple of minutes of speech-making in him that day. It seems entirely likely that his original intent was to give the sort of hour-long oration that would have been expected from a man of his station at an occasion of that type. But as he boarded the train and began feeling worse and worse during the outbound journey, he concluded he would need to come up with a much briefer Plan B. And we don't know whether that Plan B that we wound up knowing as the Gettysburg Address was excerpted or adapted from some original text, but we do know that each time Lincoln was observed by the other members of his traveling party on the train to Gettysburg, he was observed in the act of writing, which would tend to lead one to the belief that he was writing the thing from scratch rather than grabbing excerpts from a larger text, because it doesn't take a whole lot of time to copy 217 words down that you have already written. It seems more likely that he concluded, I'm only going to have a few minutes in me, so I can't beat around the bush here. I will need to say as much as I can in as few words as possible, and hopefully I will be able to come up with something that befits the gravity and the solemnity of the occasion. But it's not possible, I don't think, for us here in the 3rd decade of the 21st century to properly contextualize the Gettysburg Address in terms of the way it would have been received and interpreted in the 7th decade of the 19th without an assist from the Reverend Edward Everett, who was the featured speaker that day. Everett was just about as accomplished a man as it's possible to be. Former congressman, former senator, former secretary of state, former governor of Massachusetts, former minister to Great Britain, former president of Harvard College, and widely regarded as one of the best, if not the very best, public speakers the United States had to offer. And when we say featured speaker, that's not meant to imply that his speech was more important than the president's speech, but rather that it would be the longest oration of the day. As the featured speaker, the people who came to the event would have been expecting Everett to deliver an oration of around 2 hours in length, and they were probably expecting around an hour from Mr. Lincoln afterward. In the actual event, the 2 paragraphs of Everett's opening preamble and closing benediction wound up being twice again as long as Lincoln's entire address, which would have been seen as completely shocking by the people in attendance, scandalous even, bordering on vulgarity. And we have to also consider, in order to properly contextualize the events of the day, that before the invention of the microphone and the amplifier and the loudspeaker, public oration was more of a trial of physical endurance than anything we can imagine today. By most accounts, there were around 15,000 people in attendance that day. To put that in perspective, if you're in a residential area right now, imagine having to speak loudly enough to be clearly understood by the guy 7 or 8 houses down the street, and imagine maintaining that volume level for 13,000 words and over 120 minutes. That was Edward Everett's remit at Gettysburg that day, a man who was already 68 years old and would only live a further 14 months. He doesn't even survive the end of the war, as it turns out. I'm going to read out his preamble and his benediction because in order to understand how shocking Lincoln's address was, not just in brevity but also in style, we need to be able to juxtapose it with the address that preceded it, which was given in the standard oratorial style of the day. Begin quote. Standing beneath this serene sky, overlooking these broad fields now reposing from the labors of the waning year, the mighty Alleghanies dimly towering before us, the graves of our brethren beneath our feet, it is with hesitation that I raise my poor voice to break the eloquent silence of God and nature. But the duty to which you have called me must be performed. Grant me, I pray you, your indulgence, and your sympathy. Everett then spends the best part of 2 hours taking his audience on a trip through the entire recorded history of martial conflict. He takes us from the Peloponnesian War to the Battle of Marathon, to the Wars of the Roses, to the English Civil War, to the American Revolution and the battles of Bunker Hill and Lexington, to the Napoleonic Wars, to Russia and Germany and Italy and elsewhere. He introduces us to Pericles and Julius Caesar and Peter the Great and Charles I and Oliver Cromwell and James II and George Washington and the Duke of Wellington, among others. His ultimate aim in these exertions and these references is to place the Battle of Gettysburg, of which he also provides a painstakingly detailed account, as if the people of Gettysburg are in need of one, into what he feels is its proper historical context. And when he's satisfied that he has achieved his purpose, he closes the speech as follows. And now, friends, fellow citizens of Gettysburg and Pennsylvania, and you from remoter states, let me again, as we part, invoke your benediction on these honored graves. You feel, though the occasion is mournful, that it is good to be here. You feel that it was greatly auspicious for the cause of the country that the men of the East and the men of the West, the men of 19 sister states, stood side by side on the perilous ridges of the battle. You now feel it a new bond of union, that they shall lie side by side, till a clarion, louder than that which marshaled them to the combat, shall awaken their slumbers. God bless the Union. It is dearer to us for the blood of brave men which has been shed in its defense, the spots on which they stood and fell, these pleasant heights, the fertile plain beneath them, the thriving village whose streets so lately rang with the strange din of war, the fields beyond the ridge where the noble Reynolds held the advancing foe at bay and, while he gave up his own life, ensured by his forethought and self-sacrifice the triumph of the 2 succeeding days, the little streams which wind through the hills on whose banks in aftertimes the wondering plowman will turn up with the rude weapons of savage warfare, the fearful missiles of modern artillery. Seminary Ridge, the Peach Orchard, Cemetery, Culp and Wolf Hill, Round Top, Little Round Top, humble names henceforward dear and famous, no lapse of time, no distance of space, shall cause you to be forgotten. The whole earth, said Pericles, as he stood over the remains of his fellow citizens who had fallen in the first year of the Peloponnesian War, the whole earth is the sepulchre of illustrious men. All time, he might have added, is the millennium of their glory. Surely I would do no injustice to the other noble achievements of this war, which have reflected such honor on both arms of the service, and have entitled the armies and the navy of the United States, their officers and men, to the warmest thanks and the richest rewards which a grateful people can pay. But they, I am sure, will join us in saying, as we bid farewell to the dust of these martyr heroes, that wheresoever throughout the civilized world the accounts of this great warfare are read, and down to the latest period of recorded time in the glorious annals of our common country, there will be no brighter page than that which relates the battles of Gettysburg. End quote. It's really a fantastic speech, and I do recommend reading it in its entirety. I will drop a link to the full text in the description. So imagine yourself being in the crowd, having just listened to that booming, thunderous, 2-hour oratorical tour de force from Edward Everett, and then President Lincoln shuffles up to the rostrum with a ghostly gray pallor to his face, looking disheveled and really quite unwell, and he only manages 2 minutes and 217 words, his voice so weak he can't even be clearly understood by most of the attendees. I guarantee you none of the people who were there that day would have been inclined to conclude they had just witnessed the greatest speech in American history. But why then do we view it that way? I happen to think that has much to do with the first 5 words, 87 years ago. If he had said 87 years ago or nearly a century ago, would that speech be as legendary as it is? I don't think so, not a chance, and I'll tell you why. As we just heard in those selections from the Everett speech, it was the fashion of the day for writers and speakers to imitate the classical style of the ancient Greek orators, but Lincoln went in a biblical direction. In a society where every person was heavily steeped in the language of the King James Bible, contemporary listeners and readers would have recognized the phrase 87 years ago as an oblique reference to Psalms chapter 90, verse 10, in which, in the King James Version, a man's lifespan is described as 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength, they be 80 years. So in that brief little 5-word opening, look at everything Lincoln has done. He has alluded not only to the Judeo-Christian origins of the country's founding, but also to the language of the mother country, and in a very specific period, because the King James Version is published in 1611, and it's the version that's carried aboard the Mayflower 9 years later when the Puritans set sail for New England, the version that becomes the basis of the Mayflower Compact and the governance of Plymouth Colony, the ancestral document of all subsequent American government. Lincoln did that in 5 words, because Lincoln was a genius. And it all arose out of the fact that he felt deathly ill and just wanted to go crawl back into bed. And Edward Everett recognized it too. Some people think he was just blowing smoke up the president's ass when he later wrote him a note saying, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." I don't think he was blowing smoke. I think he was recognizing genius. I think that's one master craftsman saying to another, "Sir, I stand in awe of your talent." The newspapers, they got it completely wrong, as they often do. Some of the Republican-aligned northern papers tried to be positive, but the praise was mostly rather tepid because it would have been seen as rather embarrassing that the president only managed 2 minutes of remarks on such an august occasion. The Democrat-aligned papers, they were vociferous in their condemnations. The Chicago Times called it a silly, flat, dishwatery thing. The Cincinnati Enquirer said it was a perversion of history. The Harrisburg Patriot and Union said the president had delivered silly remarks deserving the veil of oblivion. And a correspondent for the Times of London said the ceremony had been rendered ludicrous by some of the luckless sallies of that poor President Lincoln. However, the Harrisburg Patriot News, the successor of the Patriot and Union, did issue a retraction of its previous reporting 150 years later in 2013, when its editorial page wrote the following, quote, 70 years ago, the forefathers of this media institution brought forth to its audience a judgment so flawed, so tainted by hubris, so lacking in the perspective history would bring, that it cannot remain unaddressed in our archives. The Patriot and Union failed to recognize the speech's momentous importance, timeless eloquence, and lasting significance. The Patriot News regrets the error. End quote. I am done. That's all I've got. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Do feel free to like and subscribe and to drop a few coins in the hat if you are so inclined. Links in description. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Get off my lawn.